So, Kareem, we're going to start by talking about understanding context.
Before we begin, why? Why does it matter? Like, what got you so interested in context in the first place?
So that's a good question. Probably going back to the last century.
Yes, when you were a student
I was a
at
student
Harvard Business School.
in
Last century, guys. Last century.
1990.
I thought it was 89.
1989, I arrived at Harvard. 1990, I made it to our classroom.
Oh, I
at
see.
HBS.
I see. Okay.
And I was sitting in our MBA classroom, and our instructors, many of whom are still our colleagues here, were talking about, how do you motivate people? How do you set up a factory floor? How do you design a compensation contract? How do you raise capital for a company?
Yeah.
And our family owned a number of enterprises in India. And I remember thinking, this ain't gonna work.
Yeah.
None of this stuff is gonna work. It doesn't have a snowball chance in hell. If I go to my factory manager who's an educated guy and I say, you have to take these options and you'll have an incentive pay and it's gonna pay off down the road. Emerging markets are volatile places.
Yeah.
And nobody wants something that's paying off down the road.
Yes.
They want to be paid right now.
Immediate, yeah.
So it's a small example of how I thought that the logic that the instructors were communicating was eminently sensible. It's just that the application of the logic to different circumstances gave you very different action plans.
Got it.
And I began to think that it would be nice to have a little bit of a mental map for, imagine that you're somebody who wants to affect change.
Yes.
You're an entrepreneur, you're even a scientist, you're a politician, you're an activist.
Yes.
And you show up in some place and you are naturally drawing on the repertoire of your own experiences
Yes.
and trying to figure out what is it that I know from the past that's likely to work here and what isn't. You ought to have a mental map of where you are to understand how to do that mapping of past expertise to current situation.
So even if you're not in a situation like what we find ourselves in our campus, like multinationals going to a new country, even if you're locally in the country and you're applying your knowledge base to a particular problem, this lens of a context matters.
Yeah. So, even if you're a kid in Kinshasa or a kid in
Rio,
you are absorbing content, particularly in this day and age, and everybody's connected.
Yes.
Most people are connected anyway, and we'll probably get to that. You're absorbing content from everywhere else. How do you know what you're hearing about from New York City makes any sense for you?
Yeah.
You still need a mental map. In most cases, it's implicit.
Got it.
So what I was trying to do in my work for the last several decades
He's old.
is create a toolkit for people to. So that's what we'll talk about.
Got it. Great.
So I thought one simple way to explain this was going back to an experience I had in the southern Indian city of what I used to call Madras, which is now called Chennai.
Yes.
And I just remember a particular episode when my family and I arrived there. It's a very hot city.
Yeah.
In a nice hotel.
Yeah.
And one of the family members had some medication, and so we needed an ice pack.
Yes.
And now in the U.S., what do you do when you need an ice pack?
You just go to the hotel floor, and then there's ice machine.
So we went down. There's no such thing as an ice machine.
Yes.
We asked for an ice pack. He had no idea what a pack was.
What is an ice pack?
What is an ice pack? It didn't exist, right?
Yeah, you can easily go to a 7-Eleven or a corner
You
grocery
go to
store.
CVS or 7-Eleven and get it. So there's no CVS and no 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
This is now in the 80s.
Yes.
1980s, right? So what ensued then was, probably my dad calling someone he knew and someone he knew saying, don't worry, Mr. Khanna, we'll take care of this.
Yes.
And sending like 5 people wandering down the city looking for ice. And then making ice pieces and putting them in an ice bag and bringing them to the hotel and giving it to us. And I remember thinking when I was trying to communicate the importance of understanding context to our executives who are, activists and CEOs from all over the world, I remember thinking, this is a great way to explain this. If you just compute the ratio of the value of the ice pack to you to the amount of expenditure of effort and time
Yes.
in getting the ice back, right? That number is probably, I computed, compared to going to the CVS or corner store and coming back, is like a 1-to-1.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas if you compute it for Chennai in 1980,
Yes.
it's like 1-to-10 or 1-to-20 or something like that.
Yes.
So you have 20 times more effort
To get the same ice,
to get the same
functionality
thing,
of the ice
same
pack.
functionality.
Yeah.
So I think
we take it for granted. Like,
we take it for granted,
in our
right.
settings, like, of course there's ice
Right.
packs. There's many ways to get ice.
Yeah.
Right. And versus in Chennai,
there was nothing.
at that time
in
there
Now, it's
wasn't.
different today, of course. It's a modern city, but I think that makes the point. So why don't we talk about a contemporary example?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all lived through this COVID-19 pandemic.
Perfect.
And so, yeah, tell us how this applies in this setting.
So one of the things that I found myself, and I think all of us found ourselves in the same situation when the pandemic hit. Of course, we went through this lockdown period and everybody was trying to isolate. We didn't know how deadly the virus was. Mortality in some cities, New York City, Rome, was extremely high. New Delhi later on was extremely high. And we were all worried. But after that, we had our local friends, the Moderna colleagues, and the Pfizer and colleagues in Germany, the Turkish-German entrepreneur who came up with the mRNA vaccine. So we had a solution, so to speak. But the part after that was sort of interesting because for a long time, almost 2 or 3 months, at least in Boston, nobody that I knew could figure out where the vaccine was available.
Yes.
Right. Of course, there was scarcity, there was production constraints, and so on.
I remember going to various websites at late at night or early in the morning saying, like, which pharmacy has a vaccine? And like, can I get an appointment?
Can I get an appointment?
Yes. So I wanted a Moderna one. I didn't want a J&J one.
Right.
You know, all that
we didn't know
stuff.
what the efficacy of the different ones were. The mRNA ones were reputedly better, but who knew about the long-term consequences? Anyway, so there was an information vacuum that gradually began to be filled in. Right? And in the absence of information, it's very difficult to transact.
Yes.
Right? To get anything done, to collaborate.
Yes.
Right? If I want to work with you on some creative enterprise, say on shooting this video, first I have to know who you are.
Yeah.
If I didn't know who you were, then I would wander around, effectively, metaphorically wander around and say, how do I find a good interlocutor, intellectual partner, a buddy that I can work with, despite being a pain.
He's the pain.
So whether it's collaboration or transacting, right? So you can think of getting a vaccine shot as a transaction, right? I have a demand for a vaccine because I'd rather not get COVID. Somebody else has a supply of vaccine, either because they're doctors or they're pharma companies or pharmacies, etc. So that information is missing and transaction is almost impossible. So one of the purposes of the mental map of a conceptual framework for understanding context is that you pay attention to the emergence of these institutions that help you resolve this information problem.
Got it.
That's a central thing.
Got it.
So let's turn to another aspect of this vaccine business that makes the point. There was also a lot of misrepresentation and fraud.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Tons.
Leave aside the rampant fraud in other countries of vaccine being faked.
Yes.
But even in Newton, Massachusetts, where I live, which is a nice community, leafy green, affluent, etc., you had people misrepresenting their status.
Yes.
Right? I know that for a fact. Misrepresenting the status and saying, I deserve it because I'm compromised, and producing something to, because they wanted to jump the line and make sure that they got it. And that, in those kinds of situations where you don't have adjudication mechanisms or redress mechanisms.
Like, how do you judge the veracity
How do
of
you
a claim?
judge, exactly, how do you judge the veracity of a potential collaborating or transacting partner?
Yes.
Right? Those mechanisms again began to emerge over time to police this, to make sure that somebody who says, I have a stockpile of vaccine, actually had it and was not misrepresenting it, or equivalently, someone who said they didn't have it but had it, was representing the status correctly. All those mechanisms emerged over a year, 2 years, something like that. It did take that long. There was a proliferation, as you were saying earlier, of websites, etc. So step back for a second. What we've just outlined with a very simple example is in a contemporary situation of uncertainty triggered by an environmental event, the arrival of this mutated virus that was affecting humans all over the world, and the corollary event of a technological
Yes.
achievement, the creation of the mRNA vaccine, triggered all this flux. And the institutions that were needed to ensure that information flowed freely and that people were not misrepresenting their ability or willingness to engage in discourse and exchange emerged over time.
Yeah, so what's interesting, as you're saying, is that even in a highly developed context like Boston, Massachusetts, the vaccine literally was developed a mile away from here where we're sitting today. Even in that situation, there was information gaps,
everywhere,
right? And this adjudication gap, like not knowing how to test whatever claims people are making exist. Right, and so even this is everywhere. This is not just an emerging market situation. In any kind of a context, you have this kind of information asymmetries, information missings, and knowing how to.
So a lot of our colleagues here at Harvard and elsewhere, our former students, have developed this idea of thinking over the last decades.
Yes.
And one of the things which seems obvious in hindsight with this COVID example is that any discontinuity triggers what in effect becomes an emerging market, right?
Yes.
Because the market literally has to emerge.
Yeah.
And what is a market? It's just a set of norms, right? And a set of rules for information exchange and
transactions,
veracity of representation.
Yes.
And that's a fact of life when you walk down the street anywhere. It doesn't have to be Chennai in 1980.
Yeah.
Or Rio a long time ago. It could just as easily be Boston and London or any place else.
It's very helpful.
So that's why I think that just having a rough and ready mental map of context is so important.
Yeah.
Let me give you one more example on the vaccine situation. Even though we've been talking about the slowness with which information and contracting institutions emerge, so the absence I refer to as a situation of an institutional void. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the idea is that institution that allows us to have access to information requires some effort and premeditation and some economic viability in and of itself, and those take time to establish. But when they're absent, we refer to them as an absence, a void.
Yeah.
Even though those voids are everywhere, there is a change in the ambiance. They're particularly severe in developing countries.
Yeah.
Right? And they're particularly severe in, shall we say, attempts to exchange things across countries where there is cultural nuance, intercultural misunderstandings.
India versus Pakistan.
India versus Pakistan. Yes, I'm of Indian origin. He's of Pakistani origin. So
we speak different languages, but we understand each other.
But we understand each other. Related in different languages, yes. Yeah. So one example going back to the COVID situation was, of course, we knew exactly what was going to happen, right? That somebody eventually, hopefully, would come up with a vaccine.
Yes.
And when that happened, there would be scarcity.
Yes.
All this was predicted.
Yes, 100%.
There would be scarcity because the factories would have to be tooled up, production facilities, the economics, etc. Governments would hem and haw about putting money into it.
Yes.
The political contestation would ensue. You knew that was going to happen. Therefore, you also knew that rich countries would grab everything.
Yeah.
Right. And so I had the good fortune to make a friend, Seth Berkley, who was just recently stepped down as the head of Gavi.
Yes.
Gavi is the French acronym for World Vaccine Alliance in Geneva.
Yes.
And Gavi's purpose, Gavi was seeded by Bill Gates a very long time ago, 20 plus years ago. But the whole idea was, how do you get equity in vaccines?
Yes.
And traditionally, of course, it had applied to vaccines that have been known for a long time, but were too expensive for poor people. And so Gavi
like measles and polio.
All kinds of stuff, right. Gavi was the entity that got access to those vaccines at concessional rates.
Yes.
So in effect, Gavi was an intermediary, right, was filling an institutional void between demand from poorer countries and poorer people for vaccines and supply of vaccines in generally richer countries. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that you can think about the ice pack example in Chennai as a very tiny daily example of where an institution matters. You can't find the information. Or you can think at this abstract, highfalutin level of Gavi, organizing contracts between heads of state in different places. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you just go back to the primitives. That's why I like being an academic. is that you can cut to the chase very quickly for what's really going on. And then if you have the predisposition, as we do, you can use that to hopefully make some good changes.
So if I can summarize, Tarun, what I'm hearing is like, look, in any kind of a situation, any kind of a new situation with new uncertainties, there will be a need for information. Often information is missing. And even as information becomes available, there's going to be this need to say, like, what kind of information do we really believe and trust? Because there'll be competing interests going after that. And so that creates this void. It creates this void. And so you need, in order for the transactions to take place, for me to buy the vaccine, for me to get the ice pack, we need some kind of like a mechanism, some kind of an organization that can fill that void, right? That gap. And that's where so you both examine the institutional voids that may exist in markets, and then say, what are the different ways in which those could be filled?
Precisely.
So in a high-end setting like the vaccine, Gavi comes in, funded by Bill Gates, trying to solve the vaccine access problem. But then in a very simple ice pack example, you can imagine, some entrepreneur saying, lots of Western tourists are coming to our city.
Absolutely.
They need ice for some reason.
And there's a buck to be made. There's a buck to be made.
So let's create the ice pack company.
These strange people coming to Chennai who are white, not me, of course, but who are white people, and they're kind of wandering around. They need ice because they're not used to this heat. There's a buck to be made. If it costs a rupee in India, I can probably sell it to this guy who has no idea for $5, because otherwise he's going to spend another $50 trying to get it.
The ice.
So that actually is a very important point, which is these institutional voids are both constraints on action, because they might prevent us from collaborating or consummating contracts or what have you. But they're also opportunities. They are. So it's a double-edged sword.
That's why I
love it. As you know, I love starting things.
Yes, a lot of things, including this thing that we're doing.
But I look at this and I say, it's like a kid in a candy store. I can build all these organizations and nonprofits and businesses and so on and so forth. So again, going back to the basic idea, I think the reason I'm so fixated on developing this mental map for context is that for me it's a way to both avoid pitfalls but also to identify opportunities.
Fabulous.